Jack stirred awake on Christmas morning, the faint light of dawn casting a dim glow across his room. He blinked at the ceiling, wondering if it was worth getting up at all. Outside, a light dusting of snow fell gently, blanketing his neighborhood with a quiet peace that felt completely foreign to him. It was his first Christmas alone in years, and he hadn't planned anything special. No decorations, no tree, just a silent, undecorated house. He pulled himself out of bed reluctantly, tugging on a sweater before heading down to the kitchen to make coffee. The stillness pressed on him, heavy and unwelcoming. He'd always loved Christmas mornings, but this one felt hollow. As he sipped his coffee and looked out the window, he noticed something unusual by the front door, a large, carefully wrapped box sitting perfectly centered on his doormat. He blinked, confused. He hadn't ordered anything, and he wasn't expecting a gift from anyone. Curiosity piqued. Jack set his mug down and went to the door, pulling it open to reveal the package in its full, festive glory. The box was wrapped in red and gold, complete with an oversized bow and a small white card tucked under the ribbon. For a moment, he just stood there, unsure if he wanted to know who had left it. But eventually, his curiosity got the best of him, and he reached for the card. It was in Emily's handwriting, unmistakably neat and precise. "Thought you'd want these back. Merry Christmas." There was no signature, no warmth in the words, just a direct, almost cold message. He gritted his teeth, feeling a familiar pang of regret mixed with frustration. He hadn't seen Emily since their breakup months ago, and he certainly hadn't expected her to reach out, alone like this. Jack brought the package inside, setting it on his coffee table with an unsettling mix of anticipation and dread. The last thing he wanted was to reopen old wounds, especially today. But he couldn't help himself. He needed to know what was inside, even if it hurt. With steady hands, he tore into the wrapping paper, peeling it back to reveal a plain brown box beneath. Inside, carefully nestled in tissue paper, were things he'd forgotten about entirely. Books, trinkets, even a couple of framed photos from their time together. Each item felt like a jab to his heart, bringing back memories he'd tried to bury. At the very top of the pile was a small note, handwritten in that same, familiar script. "Here's to a merry single life. Don't say I never gave you anything." Jack clenched his jaw, feeling a surge of bitterness. Emily's gift wasn't about kindness. It was a reminder, a twisted farewell wrapped up like a holiday present. But even as he tried to brush it off, he couldn't ignore the emotions bubbling up, forcing him to confront feelings he'd been avoiding for months. Jack spent a long time staring at the box, unable to decide what to do with it. The contents felt like a Pandora's box, each item charged with memories, some happy, some painful. As much as he wanted to toss everything away, a part of him was drawn to it, compelled to confront each memory. He took a deep breath and reached for the first item, a small, ceramic mug painted with silly, childish patterns. Emily had given it to him after a road trip, saying it reminded her of his goofy side, the part of him she claimed was her favorite. He hadn't thought about that trip in ages, but now the memory was so vivid he could almost hear her laughter. Setting the mug aside, he reached for a small photo album, its cover worn from use. He flipped through its pages, each photo bringing back moments he thought he'd forgotten. Lazy Sundays, impromptu dinners, and stolen kisses. With each picture, he felt a mixture of fondness and regret, the memories bittersweet under the harsh light of their breakup. One by one, he unpacked the items, each a small fragment of a life he no longer had. And with each piece, he felt the walls he'd built around his emotions start to crack. Emily's parting gift was meant to sting, and it did. But more than that, it was making him confront what he'd lost, something he had avoided facing until now. As he reached the bottom of the box, he found a last item he hadn't noticed before, a small, handwritten letter, sealed with a piece of tape. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But once again, curiosity got the better of him. He peeled the tape back and unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Jack, I know we ended things badly, and I know we both said things we didn't mean, but I wanted you to have these. They're as much a part of you as they were of me. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remind you of the good parts, too. Goodbye, Jack. I hope you find what you're looking for." The words hit him harder than he expected, leaving him feeling raw and exposed. He hadn't been ready to confront his emotions, but Emily's words forced him to see things clearly. As much as he hated to admit it, he'd been running from his feelings, burying them under sarcasm and indifference. But now, faced with the tangible pieces of his past, he realized he couldn't keep running forever. He set the letter down, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. This Christmas morning had turned out differently than he'd anticipated, stirring up emotions he'd thought were long buried. And while he wasn't sure what to do with these feelings yet, one thing was clear. Emily's gift had forced him to confront the person he had been and the person he still wanted to be. Jack sat on the couch, the box and its contents scattered around him. The silence in the room felt thick and suffocating, weighted by memories he'd rather not relive. Just as he was reaching for his coffee to distract himself, a soft knock sounded on his door. Confused, he glanced at the clock. It was still early for any holiday visitors. He stood up and went to the door, opening it to find his neighbor, Sarah, standing there, a small tin of cookies in her hands and a bright, tentative smile on her face. "Hey, Jack," she greeted, a bit uncertainly. "I thought I'd drop by and say Merry Christmas." Jack managed a tight smile, fighting the urge to put on a mask of forced cheer. "Merry Christmas, Sarah. Thanks for the cookies." He took the tin, noting the warmth radiating from it. Sarah lingered at the door, her gaze dropping to the mess of items visible on his coffee table. Her smile softened, eyes filled with understanding that Jack found oddly comforting. "I hope I'm not intruding. Just thought maybe you could use some company." Jack hesitated, but something about her gentle approach made it difficult to turn her away. He gestured her inside, shutting the door behind her. Sarah settled herself on the armchair across from him, her gaze still on the items spread across the table. She didn't pry or ask questions, but Jack could sense her curiosity and her empathy. He exhaled, feeling the weight of unspoken words pressing on him, words he wasn't sure he could say aloud. Yet the silence stretched between them, inviting him to share. "Emily left this on my doorstep this morning," he said finally, gesturing to the open box. It's everything I left behind after we broke up." Sarah nodded slowly, her face thoughtful. "I take it you weren't expecting this, then?" "No, not all," Jack replied, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "Honestly, I thought we'd both moved on, or at least that I had." The confession surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Sarah. He hadn't talked about the breakup with anyone, not in any meaningful way. Sarah leaned forward, her expression gentle yet probing. "Maybe she wanted you to remember the good times, too. Sometimes, the hardest part of moving on is letting go of the good with the bad." Jack looked away, uncertain if he was ready to face what her words suggested. The feelings swirling inside him were a mess of regret, anger, and something else he couldn't quite define. For a moment, he wondered if he should just close the box and put it all behind him again. But a part of him knew he couldn't. "Maybe you're right," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. That evening, after Sarah had left, Jack sat alone in the quiet of his living room, the remnants of Emily's gift still laid out around him. Sarah's words lingered in his mind, tugging at emotions he'd long kept locked away. He knew it wasn't just the items in the box that had unsettled him. It was the memories they carried. Unable to ignore the weight pressing down on him, Jack reached for one of the framed photos from the box. It was from the first Christmas he and Emily had spent together, a picture of them standing in front of her family's fireplace, wrapped in matching red scarves and laughing. He remembered that night vividly, the warmth, the laughter, the sense of belonging he'd felt with her family. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since. The more he lingered over the memories, the more he felt a sense of loss, not just of Emily, but of the part of himself he'd let go of. With her, he'd allowed himself to be vulnerable, to share his life in a way he hadn't before or since. The realization stung, leaving him feeling raw and exposed. As the evening wore on, Jack couldn't stop the memories from pouring in, each one layered with bittersweet emotions. There were moments of joy and comfort, but also the fights, the misunderstandings, and the growing distance that eventually pulled them apart. He'd told himself that breaking up was for the best, that he needed to focus on his career and his own goals. But now, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. In the dim light, he leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him, unfiltered and unforgiving. The truth settled heavily in his chest. He'd pushed her away because he'd been afraid of committing fully, afraid of the vulnerability that came with real love. He'd hidden behind his ambition, telling himself it was enough, that he didn't need anyone else. But sitting there, alone, on Christmas night, he realized that he missed the life he could have had with her. The regret was sharp, and for the first time in months, he let himself feel it fully. Eventually, he reached for his phone, fingers hovering over Emily's contact. He considered calling her, imagining what he might say, but he hesitated, the weight of pride and lingering resentment holding him back. He didn't know if he was ready to make that call, to admit his mistakes. With a heavy sigh, he set the phone down, feeling exhausted from the flood of emotions. For now, he would just sit with his memories, acknowledging the pain they brought and the lessons they held. He wasn't ready to reach out, but he was beginning to understand that he couldn't keep running from his past. The day drifted into evening, and Jack found himself standing in front of his closet, staring blankly at his clothes. He'd barely slept since the morning's events, and his mind was a jumble of conflicted emotions. The idea of sitting alone in his house felt unbearable, so when Sarah invited him to Christmas dinner at her place, he'd hesitated before finally agreeing. He arrived at Sarah's with a bottle of wine, feeling awkward but grateful for the distraction. Sarah welcomed him with a warm smile, guiding him into her cozy, festively decorated living room. Twinkling lights adorned her tree, and the scent of rosemary and roasted vegetables filled the air, giving the space a homey, inviting atmosphere. They sat down at her small dining table, their plates filled with roast chicken, potatoes, and vegetables. The conversation started light, but Jack's mind kept drifting back to the box, and Sarah, always perceptive, seemed to sense his distraction. "So, how are you feeling after this morning?" she asked gently, breaking the silence. Jack paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He set it down, staring at his plate. "Honestly, I don't even know," he admitted. "I thought I'd moved on, but seeing all those things again, it just brought everything back." Sarah nodded, listening intently. Sometimes we tell ourselves we're over something because it's easier than dealing with it. But maybe there's still something you need to face. Jack sighed, frustrated by the weight of his own emotions. "I just don't understand why she did it. Why send me a box of memories? Was it some kind of twisted revenge?" Sarah shook her head, thoughtfully. "Maybe she wanted you to remember the good times, too. Or maybe it was her way of finding closure." She took a sip of her wine, watching him carefully. It's hard to let go of someone you cared about, even when things end badly. Jack's jaw clenched as he tried to process her words. He knew she was right, but admitting it felt like a blow to his pride. He'd spent so long convincing himself that he'd done the right thing by focusing on his career, by putting his needs first. But now, with the memories fresh in his mind, he was beginning to wonder if he'd been selfish, if he'd run from something good out of fear. Their conversation grew quiet, each lost in their thoughts as they ate. After a few minutes, Sarah spoke again, her tone softer. "You know, Jack, I've always thought there was more to you than what you let people see. Maybe this is your chance to find out who you really are, without the fear of messing up." Her words struck a chord, stirring something deep within him. For so long, he'd kept his guard up, afraid to show vulnerability. But maybe it was time to take a closer look at himself, to understand why he'd pushed Emily away, and what he could do to avoid making the same mistakes. He thanked Sarah for dinner, feeling more thoughtful than he had in a long time. As he walked back to his house, he resolved to finally confront the parts of himself he'd ignored for so long. The next morning, Jack woke up feeling strangely lighter, as if his conversation with Sarah had lifted some of the weight pressing on his chest. He brewed a cup of coffee and settled back into the couch, staring at the remnants of Emily's box still strewn across his living room. He picked up a few of the items, running his fingers over the photos and trinkets, feeling an odd mix of nostalgia and regret. He could no longer ignore the truth that had been nagging at him since the box arrived. He hadn't been a fair partner to Emily. He'd convinced himself he was too focused on his career to make room for her, that she was asking too much. But maybe, just maybe, he hadn't tried hard enough. He picked up the letter she'd left him, reading it over again. Her words were simple, but cut deep, like a mirror reflecting back his own faults. She'd given him everything, and he'd given her only parts of himself, unwilling to commit fully. He realized now that he'd been protecting himself, building walls to avoid the vulnerability that real love required. The realization hit him hard, leaving him feeling hollow and exposed. It was painful to admit that he'd been selfish, that he'd let fear dictate his actions. But as uncomfortable as the truth was, it also felt like a release, a painful but necessary step toward understanding himself. Jack leaned back, closing his eyes as he let the epiphany sink in. For so long, he'd been blaming Emily for the end of their relationship, convincing himself that she was the one who demanded too much. But now he saw things differently. She'd wanted love and commitment, and he hadn't been ready to give it. And in that unwillingness, he'd lost something real, something he hadn't appreciated until it was too late. The realization was heavy, yet oddly liberating. He couldn't change the past, but he could learn from it. He could face the parts of himself he'd hidden away and try to be better. The thought filled him with a sense of purpose, a desire to move forward, even if the path was uncertain. With a renewed sense of determination, Jack decided to do something he'd been avoiding since the breakup. He reached for his phone and looked up Emily's number. His fingers hovered over the screen, his heart pounding as he debated whether to call. Part of him wanted to apologize, to tell her that he understood now, that he saw his own mistakes. But another part, the part that still held on to pride, resisted. In the end, he set the phone down, deciding against calling her. It wasn't fair to drag her back into his life just because he was finally coming to terms with his own issues. She deserved peace, just as he did. But the decision to let go felt like a victory, a step toward healing and growth. Jack spent the rest of the morning cleaning up, putting away the remnants of Emily's gift. For the first time since the breakup, he felt a sense of closure. Not because he'd forgotten her, but because he'd finally confronted his own mistakes and was ready to move on. After days of introspection and coming to terms with his mistakes, Jack found himself sitting in his kitchen with his phone in hand. He made a promise to himself to leave Emily alone, to let her move on without being dragged back into his life. But a nagging voice in his mind kept urging him to reach out, to find closure by acknowledging his part in the breakup directly to her. The more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that an apology could bring a sense of resolution, not just for him, but for her too. He didn't expect forgiveness or a second chance. He simply wanted to take responsibility. With a steadying breath, he dialed her number, his heart pounding as he waited for her to answer. After a few rings, Emily's voice came through, cool and guarded. "Hello." "Hi, Emily," Jack said, his voice softer than he'd intended. It's Jack. I hope I'm not bothering you." There was a long pause on the other end, and he could almost picture her expression. Surprised, perhaps even wary. "Jack, it's unexpected to hear from you." He cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "I won't take up much of your time. I wanted to apologize. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realized that I wasn't fair to you during our relationship. I wasn't ready to give you the commitment you deserved, and I pushed you away when things got tough." Emily remained silent, letting him speak. He could hear her breathing softly, a reminder of how close yet far away she felt. "I know I hurt you, and I'm truly sorry," he continued. "You deserved better than the half-hearted effort I gave, and it wasn't right. I just needed you to know that." For a moment, all he heard was the faint static on the line. Then, Emily's voice broke the silence, measured but calm. Thank you for saying that, Jack. It means a lot. I've moved on, but I'm glad to know you understand. Her words struck a bittersweet chord in him, a reminder that she'd found peace, even if he was only now finding his own. Part of him wanted to ask more, to seek out the details of her new life, but he resisted. This conversation wasn't about rekindling anything. It was about closure. Well, I won't keep you, he said, forcing a smile he knew she couldn't see. Take care, Emily. You too, Jack, she replied gently before the line went dead. Jack set the phone down, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He'd taken the step he needed, and while it didn't bring the satisfaction he hoped for, it gave him a sense of finality. Emily was in his past, and now he could truly start moving forward. In the days that followed his call with Emily, Jack threw himself into work and routine, trying to focus on the future rather than the past. But as he started to let go of his old life, he found himself pulling back from Sarah. She'd been a comforting presence, a constant he hadn't realized he needed, but now that he'd faced his past, he felt uncertain about what he could offer her. It was easier to create distance than to confront the possibility of something new. He began dodging her calls and texts, opting for brief replies and excuses when she invited him over. But Sarah, perceptive as always, seemed to pick up on the shift. One evening, after a long day, Jack was surprised to find her standing at his doorstep, a look of concern in her eyes. Hey, Jack, can we talk? Caught off guard, Jack hesitated but eventually stepped aside to let her in. They sat in his living room, an uncomfortable silence filling the space as he struggled to find the right words. Is something wrong? Sarah asked gently. You've been distant lately, and I can't help but feel like, I don't know, like you're avoiding me. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not you, Sarah. I don't know if I'm ready for anything serious. I don't want to drag you into something that I'm still figuring out myself. Sarah's expression softened, though her eyes held a hint of sadness. I understand, Jack, but feels like you're shutting me out completely. I thought we were at least friends. The words stung more than he'd expected, a reminder of the connection they'd built in the past few weeks. He'd opened up to her in ways he hadn't allowed himself to with anyone else, and now he was running from that vulnerability once again. It's complicated, he murmured, unable to meet her gaze. I just don't want to hurt you. Jack, I'm a big girl, she replied, her tone a mix of exasperation and empathy. I can handle complications, but what I can't handle is being pushed away without a reason. Her words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She was giving him a choice, to open up, to let her in, or to keep running from the very thing he was trying to understand. True connection. Jack looked at her, feeling the weight of her patience and kindness, and he knew he had to make a decision. He could either face his fear of commitment or risk losing someone who genuinely cared for him. With a deep breath, he met her gaze, the words spilling out before he could second-guess them. I'm scared, Sarah. Scared of letting someone in again. Scared of failing like I did with Emily. But I don't want to push you away. I don't know how to do this. A flicker of relief crossed her face, followed by a gentle smile. Thank you for being honest, Jack. That's all I needed to hear. They sat in silence for a while, the tension easing as they acknowledged the fears that had kept them apart. Jack knew he wasn't ready for a relationship, but he also knew that pushing Sarah away completely would only leave him feeling emptier. They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing their fears and hopes, each word a small step toward understanding. By the time Sarah left, Jack felt a new sense of clarity. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he was willing to try, to let someone in, even if it scared him. The next few weeks were a blur for Jack. Despite the breakthrough he'd felt after his conversation with Sarah, he found himself sinking back into old habits. His work became his sole focus, consuming every waking hour as he tried to distract himself from the doubts and insecurities gnawing at him. He'd convinced himself that keeping busy was the answer, that if he just worked hard enough, he'd stop thinking about the uncomfortable feelings lingering beneath the surface. But his attempts to avoid the emotional turmoil only deepened his sense of isolation. Friends reached out, but he brushed them off, using work as an excuse. Even Sarah, whom he'd finally opened up to, seemed to sense his withdrawal. She called a few times, leaving warm, patient messages, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. The closer she got, the more vulnerable he felt, and vulnerability was something he'd always avoided. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Jack sat alone in his apartment, the silence pressing in on him. He glanced at his phone, Sarah's name displayed among a few missed calls. Guilt washed over him, but he couldn't shake the voice in his head that insisted he wasn't ready. His fear of failure loomed larger than ever, and he questioned whether he was even capable of letting anyone close without repeating the mistakes he'd made with Emily. The cycle of self-doubt and isolation continued, dragging him deeper into a downward spiral. His apartment grew messier, the neglected remnants of his life piling up around him. It was as if the clutter mirrored the state of his mind, a disorganized, chaotic mess he didn't know how to fix. Finally, one night, Sarah showed up at his door unannounced, her face a mixture of worry and frustration. "Jack, what's going on? You've been shutting everyone out. And it's not like you." Jack sighed, feeling a pang of guilt, but struggling to express the storm raging inside him. "I'm just trying to figure things out. I don't want to drag you into this." Sarah's expression softened, though her concern was clear. "You don't have to do this alone, Jack. But you can't keep pushing people away every time things get hard." Her words cut through him, a painful truth he hadn't wanted to confront. He'd always prided himself on his independence, believing he could handle anything on his own. But now, faced with the reality of his loneliness, he realized that shutting people out was only making things worse. They sat in silence, the weight of his isolation pressing on him as he struggled to find a way forward. Sarah's presence reminded him that he didn't have to face his fears alone, but accepting help required vulnerability he wasn't sure he could embrace. The morning after Sarah's visit, Jack woke up feeling drained but strangely lighter. Her words had stayed with him, echoing in his mind long after she'd left. For the first time, he realized that his avoidance wasn't just hurting him, it was also affecting the people who cared about him. He'd let his fear of failure and vulnerability dictate his actions, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to make a change. Jack spent the morning cleaning his apartment, clearing away the clutter he'd let accumulate over the past few weeks. With each item he put away, he felt a small sense of control returning. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As he worked, he reflected on the choices that had led him here. He thought about Emily and the walls he'd put up in their relationship, the ways he'd let fear keep him from committing fully. And now with Sarah, he was facing the same patterns, the same inclination to withdraw instead of reaching out. By the time he finished, Jack felt a renewed sense of determination. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose to break the cycle, to stop letting fear dictate his actions. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but the alternative, losing Sarah and the chance for a genuine connection, was far worse. With a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed Sarah's number. She answered after a few rings, her voice cautious but warm. "Jack, it's good to hear from you." "Hi, Sarah," he replied, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "I wanted to talk about everything." They agreed to meet for coffee at a quiet cafe, and when he arrived, he found her already seated, looking out the window thoughtfully. She turned when he approached, offering a small smile that held a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Jack sat across from her, feeling the weight of what he wanted to say. "Sarah, I know I haven't been fair to you. I've been avoiding my own issues, and in doing so, I've been pushing you away. But I want to change. I want to learn how to let people in, even if it scares me." Her expression softened, and she reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on his. "That's all I've wanted, Jack, for you to let me be there for you. You don't have to have everything figured out. Just let me in, little by little." Jack felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of relief he hadn't expected. For so long, he'd believed that being strong meant handling everything alone, but now he saw that strength could also mean allowing himself to be vulnerable with someone he trusted. They spent hours talking, discussing their fears, hopes, and the challenges of starting something new. Jack admitted to the mistakes he'd made with Emily, the ways he'd let his ambition overshadow his relationships. Sarah listened patiently, offering insight and encouragement without judgment. As they talked, Jack felt something shift within him, a sense of possibility he hadn't felt in years. He was still uncertain about the future, still afraid of making mistakes, but he knew now that he didn't have to face those fears alone. By the time they left the cafe, he felt a newfound sense of purpose. He didn't have all the answers, but he was willing to try, to take each step forward with Sarah by his side. It was a choice he'd never thought he'd make, a choice to change, to embrace vulnerability instead of hiding from it. As they parted ways, Sarah leaned in, giving him a gentle hug that left him feeling grounded. "Remember, Jack," she said softly, "you don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you." Jack watched her walk away, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time, he felt hopeful, ready to embrace the challenges ahead. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was finally willing to let himself be open to the possibilities life had to offer. With his newfound resolve, Jack felt ready to face the last piece of unfinished business in his life, his past with Emily. He'd had time to process their relationship and the mistakes he'd made, but he still felt a lingering need to close the chapter fully. He wanted to put his thoughts into words, to express what he hadn't been able to before. He sat at his desk with a blank piece of paper in front of him, pen in hand. It felt strange, almost old-fashioned, to write a letter by hand, but somehow it felt right. He started slowly, unsure of how to put his feelings into words, but as he began writing, his thoughts flowed, raw and honest. "Dear Emily, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to say these things for my own sake, to find a way to let go. Looking back, I see so many things I could have done differently. I was selfish, scared, and unwilling to give you the commitment you deserved. I pushed you away when all you wanted was for us to build a life together, and I can finally see that now. I told myself I was focused on my career, that I didn't have time for the kind of relationship you wanted. But the truth is, I was afraid of letting someone in, of making a promise I might not be able to keep. I let that fear control me, and I lost someone who truly cared about me because of it. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not looking for us to go back. I just wanted you to know that I see my mistakes now, and I'm working to be better, to not let those same fears control me anymore. I hope you found happiness, and that you're with someone who gives you the love and commitment I couldn't. Thank you for the memories, for everything we shared. I'm sorry for the hurt I caused, and I hope this brings both of us some closure. Take care, Jack." Jack reread the letter, feeling the weight of his words settle over him. Writing it had been more cathartic than he'd expected, a release he hadn't known he needed. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, deciding he wouldn't send it. It wasn't about reaching out to Emily. It was about coming to terms with his own actions and moving forward. With a deep breath, he tucked the letter away in a drawer. For the first time since the breakup, he felt a profound sense of peace. He'd finally let go of the regret, the lingering guilt, and was ready to embrace the future, whatever it held. After putting the letter away, Jack felt a renewed sense of clarity. He knew he'd taken important steps toward understanding himself, but there was one more bridge to mend: his relationship with Sarah. She'd been there for him, even when he'd tried to shut her out, and he wanted to show her how much he valued her presence in his life. He called her the next day, inviting her to dinner at his place. She agreed, her tone warm, but with a hint of hesitation, as if she wasn't sure what to expect. Jack understood. He'd been inconsistent, and he knew he needed to rebuild her trust, to show her he was serious about letting her in. That evening, he prepared a simple but thoughtful meal, hoping to create an atmosphere where they could talk openly. When Sarah arrived, he welcomed her with a genuine smile, guiding her into the cozy, candlelit dining area. They chatted over dinner, the conversation light and easy, but there was an unspoken tension between them, a sense that something important needed to be addressed. After they finished eating, Jack took a deep breath, deciding it was time to break the silence. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I know I've been distant and unreliable, and I understand if that's made it hard for you to trust me. But I want you to know that I'm committed to being better." She looked at him, her gaze steady and searching. "Thank you, Jack. I appreciate you saying that. But I need to know if you're truly ready to let someone in. It's hard for me to open up when I don't know if you'll be there." Jack nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I understand. And I want to be honest. I'm still figuring things out, still working on myself. But I want to try to let you in, even if it scares me. You've been patient and kind, and I don't want to lose that because of my own fears." A soft smile spread across Sarah's face, her eyes warm and reassuring. "That's all I need, Jack. Just the willingness to try. I'm not asking for perfection. I just want to know that we're on this journey together." Her words filled him with a sense of relief and hope. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. They sat in comfortable silence, a new understanding settling between them. Jack knew he wasn't fully healed, that he still had work to do, but he was willing to take each step forward with her by his side. As they moved to the living room, their conversation grew more relaxed, and Jack felt a renewed sense of connection with her. They laughed, shared stories, and spoke about their dreams and fears, each word drawing them closer. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he didn't have to face everything alone, a future where he and Sarah could build something real, grounded in honesty and mutual growth. When Sarah finally left that night, Jack felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. He knew they weren't rushing into anything, but the foundation they'd built was stronger than he'd ever expected. He stood at the window, watching her car pull away, feeling grateful for the chance to start over. In that moment, Jack understood that change was a choice he'd have to make each day, to confront his fears and allow himself to be vulnerable. And while he didn't have all the answers, he was finally ready to embrace the journey, knowing that with Sarah by his side, he didn't have to face it alone. Over the next few weeks, Jack and Sarah spent more time together, taking things one step at a time. They went for long walks, shared dinners, and even tried new activities, each moment helping them grow closer and build a foundation of trust. Jack was careful to be present and open, making a conscious effort to avoid slipping back into his old patterns of avoidance and isolation. One evening, as they walked through a park decorated with twinkling holiday lights, Sarah stopped suddenly, gazing up at him with a mixture of affection and curiosity. "I can see you're making an effort, Jack. But I want to know, what does the future look like for you? Where do you see yourself in all this?" Her question took him by surprise, but he appreciated her honesty. He knew she was asking not out of pressure, but out of a desire to understand his intentions. Jack took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I'm still figuring that out," he admitted, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "But I know I want to build something real, something meaningful. I don't have all the answers, but I'm committed to finding them, with you. If you'll have me." Sarah's face softened, and she reached for his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "That's all I needed to hear, Jack. As long as you're willing to try, to keep growing, I'm here." Jack felt a wave of relief, his heart swelling with gratitude. He hadn't realized how much he needed that reassurance, that affirmation that he wasn't alone on this journey. For so long, he'd struggled with the fear of being vulnerable, but with Sarah, he was beginning to see that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. They continued their walk, talking about their dreams and the things they wanted to accomplish in the coming year. Jack found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before, sharing pieces of himself he'd kept hidden even from those closest to him. And with each conversation, each small moment of trust, he felt his walls slowly crumble. That night, as they parted ways, Jack felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. He knew he still had work to do, still had fears to face, but with Sarah by his side, he was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. As Christmas approached, Jack wanted to find a way to show Sarah how much she meant to him. He knew he didn't need to do anything grand, but he wanted to give her something meaningful, something that represented the growth and changes he'd gone through since meeting her. After a lot of thought, he decided to make her a small gift that captured the journey they'd shared. He spent days creating a scrapbook filled with photos and small mementos from their time together. Tickets from a movie they'd seen, a pressed flower from a hike they'd taken, and even a small charm he'd bought at a craft fair they'd stumbled upon. Each page told a story, a small reminder of the moments they'd shared and the bond they'd built. On Christmas Eve, he invited her over, feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves. He'd never been one for grand gestures, but this felt different. This was personal, a piece of his heart that he was offering her. When she arrived, he guided her into the living room, where a small Christmas tree stood decorated, casting a warm glow over the room. "I have something for you," Jack said, handing her the wrapped gift, his hands shaking slightly. Sarah looked at him, a soft smile on her lips as she carefully unwrapped the package, her eyes widening as she took in the scrapbook. She flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from surprise to joy as she saw the thought he'd put into each page. By the time she reached the end, there were tears in her eyes, and she looked up at him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Jack, it's beautiful. Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jack felt his own heart swell, a mixture of pride and relief filling him. He'd worried that his gift might come across as too sentimental, but the look on her face told him he'd made the right choice. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching for a small envelope he'd tucked into the back of the scrapbook. He handed it to her, watching as she opened it to reveal a handwritten note. In the note, he'd written, "Thank you for helping me find myself again, for being patient and kind. You've shown me what it means to love and be loved, and I'll be forever grateful. Merry Christmas, Sarah." She looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, and without another word, she leaned in, wrapping her arms around him in a warm, heartfelt embrace. In that moment, Jack felt a deep sense of contentment, a feeling he'd spent years chasing without ever truly finding. They spent the rest of the evening together, sharing stories and laughter, basking in the warmth of each other's company. For the first time, Jack felt a profound sense of peace, knowing he'd finally found something real, something worth holding on to. As they sat together, watching the lights twinkle on the tree, Jack realized that this was what he'd been searching for all along. Not perfection, not a life free from mistakes, but a connection grounded in honesty, trust, and mutual growth. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise that he was ready for whatever lay ahead. And as he looked into her eyes, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one he was finally ready to embrace. A year had passed since that pivotal Christmas, and Jack found himself reflecting on everything that had changed. He was no longer the same person who'd spent Christmas morning feeling bitter and isolated. Instead, he felt a sense of contentment that had once seemed impossible. He and Sarah had continued to grow together, taking each step slowly but with purpose. Their relationship was built on honesty, and every conversation brought them closer, reinforcing the trust they'd worked so hard to establish. Jack still had moments of doubt, but he'd learned to face them with Sarah by his side, finding strength in their connection. As the holiday season returned, Jack felt inspired to do something meaningful to celebrate the journey they'd shared. He planned a cozy Christmas dinner at his place, inviting Sarah over with the promise of a warm meal and a quiet night together. He decorated the house, setting up a small tree with ornaments they'd collected throughout the year, symbols of the places they'd been, the memories they'd made. When Sarah arrived, she seemed surprised by the effort he'd put into the decorations, her eyes shining as she took in the cozy, festive ambience. They shared a meal filled with laughter and warmth, their conversations flowing easily as they reminisced about the past year. After dinner, Jack took her hand, guiding her to the living room where they sat by the fire, the glow casting a soft warmth over the room. He felt a sense of nervous anticipation, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Sarah, there's something I've been wanting to say," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This past year with you has been the most meaningful time of my life. You've shown me what it means to love, to be open, to be vulnerable, and I can't imagine my life without you." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. As he opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring, Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening with surprise and joy. "Sarah, I know we've taken our time, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But I'm ready to take this next step, to build a future with you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, and after a brief, stunned silence, she nodded, a radiant smile spreading across her face. "Yes, Jack. 1,000 times, yes." They embraced, the room filled with a warmth that went beyond the holiday spirit. In that moment, Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him here. He'd found not just love, but a sense of purpose, a willingness to grow, and the courage to let go of the past. The ring symbolized not only a promise to Sarah, but a commitment to himself, to continue the journey of self-discovery, to keep building a life of meaning and connection. As they sat together, watching the snow fall softly outside, Jack felt a peace he'd once thought unattainable. The following Christmas, Jack and Sarah celebrated in their new home, the house filled with the sounds of family and friends. They decided to keep the celebration small, inviting only a few close friends to share in the warmth of the season. The house was decorated with a simple elegance, a reflection of their shared values and the life they were building together. Jack glanced around the room, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment as he watched Sarah laughing with their friends, her joy contagious. He realized how far he'd come, not just in his relationship, but in his understanding of himself. The journey hadn't been easy, but had been worth every struggle, every painful moment of introspection. After their guests had left, Jack and Sarah sat together by the fireplace, sharing a quiet moment as they reflected on the past few years. Jack pulled her close, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the life they were creating, one filled with honesty, growth, and unwavering support. As they exchanged gifts, Sarah handed him a small, beautifully wrapped package. Inside was a framed photograph, a picture of them together, standing by the same Christmas tree from the year before, surrounded by the memories they'd created. "I wanted you to have this," Sarah said, her voice soft, "to remember where we started and to look forward to where we're going." Jack smiled, feeling a warmth that went beyond words. The photograph was more than just an image. It was a symbol of everything they'd built together, a testament to the love and trust they'd nurtured. In that quiet moment, Jack knew that he'd found his home, not just in the house they shared, but in the life they were building, in the commitment they'd made to one another. He'd finally let go of the regrets and fears that had once held him back, embracing a future filled with possibility and connection. As they sat together, watching the snow fall outside, Jack felt a sense of peace that went beyond the holiday season. He'd found love, yes, but more importantly, he'd found himself, a man who was no longer afraid to open his heart, to let someone in, to believe in the power of connection. And as they welcomed a new year together, Jack looked forward to the future with an open heart, ready to embrace whatever came their way. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. It really helps us create more stories just for you. Let us know in the comments, what part of this story impacted you the most? Was it Jack's journey of self-discovery, his relationship with Sarah, or something else? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you have ideas or suggestions for stories you'd like to see on the channel, drop them below. Your feedback helps us bring you the stories you love. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more amazing tales.